r/NoSleep. Posted by you/helpcreepylandlady. I'm a paramedic and I'm plagued by nightmares about my last call out. I went outside today for the first time in over a week. As I opened the door, I noticed a translucent sheet of plastic draped across my porch. Bending down, I pinched at it with thumb and forefinger, but recoiled when an unctuous liquid oozed from it and coated my fingertips. I raised it up to get a closer look and a lump formed in my throat. A few days ago, I was called out to attend a child that had a severe fever. I've been a paramedic for the past 10 years and I love my job. No matter how stressful and gruesome it can get, I was put on this earth to help people. After over a decade, I thought there was no emergency I couldn't handle. What I saw on my last call out was enough to make me want to quit and never look back. It was late afternoon when we got the call about the child and we were told to suspect the worst, so we should be prepared to bring them back to the hospital if they were having trouble breathing. Under these circumstances, parents are typically advised to bring their children to the hospital themselves, but whatever the parents had said over the phone must have concerned the operator enough to have us called out. My partner for the day was Jacob, a fresh-faced kid in his early 20s who had qualified a few months prior. He had that kind of upbeat personality that was more infectious than obnoxious, so I enjoyed sharing my shifts with him. On top of all that, he was a skilled driver, which made my life a lot easier. We reached the house and Jacob mounted the curb. It was a quiet suburb made quieter by the current crisis. There is an eerie sense of calm to the streets at the moment. Abandoned as they are, it starts to feel as though you're on the set of a horror film, right at the point of disaster. We approached the front door with our equipment and Jacob knocked. The windows were blacked out, and I worried that we might have gotten the wrong house. After a few moments, there was a click and a creaking of wood as the door opened, but only by a sliver. In that thin gap, I made out a single bloodshot eye staring at me. Whoever was behind that eye gave me a once-over before speaking. "Are you here about my son?" she said, her voice rising and falling in tremors. "Yes, ma'am. We got a call about a child with a fever, is that right?" I said, placing my hand on the door. Her fingers, spider-like, were clasped around the wood panels so tight that they had turned pale. From the movement of those fingers, I could tell that she was shaking. "He's not a child," she said. I told the woman on the phone. "He's 16 years old." "That's all right, ma'am," I said, holding my hand firm on the door. "If he has a fever, then we still need to take a look at him. May we come inside?" A few moments passed before I heard a mumbling assent. She closed the door, unhooked the latch, and let us inside. The house had been plunged into darkness, the kind where you have to wait for your eyes to get adjusted. I turned to the woman, a small and frail creature, as she motioned up the stairs. "He's in his room," she said, her outstretched finger trembling in the dark air. Beneath her right eye, the skin had become puckered and a purplish haze of crushed veins blossomed down the side of her face. I looked back at Jacob, whose smile had long evaporated. "Let's go take a look, shall we?" I bent at the knees, picked up my bag, and hoofed it up the stairs. Once we reached the hallway, the woman went ahead and directed us to the boy's bedroom. When she opened the door, it was like the air had been sucked from my lungs. I've attended calls for domestic assault and child abuse, so I'm used to seeing some horrific cruelty, but I wasn't prepared for this. The windows had been blacked out, but in the gloom I could make out the double bed with its wrought iron frame. The boy, stripped to his boxer shorts, was spread-eagled on the bed, his arms and legs chained to the bedposts. Even in that thick darkness, I could make out faint ligature marks on his wrists and ankles. He had been like this for a while. Jacob, who lacked my sense of composure, made a guttural noise when he entered the room. I tried in vain to cover the sound with a question. "Ma'am, where is the boy's father at the moment?" "He's at work." The woman's eyes darted about the room as she spoke. "He works at the warehouse down by the old green." "I know the one," I said, trying to maintain a level tone as I spoke. "I'm just going to speak with my colleague for a moment. Please excuse us." Placing a hand on Jacob's chest, I pushed him back out of the room and far enough down the hall that I felt confident she couldn't hear us. "What the hell?" Jacob hissed, his face in an agony of twists and furrows. "Did you see that? Why would they call an ambulance out with the kid all tied up like that?" "Listen," I put my hand on Jacob's shoulder to steady him. "The dad's out of the house. This might be a cry for help. You go in there and take the kid's vitals. I'm going to step outside and call the police." Jacob nodded with that terrier-like energy of his. His eyes were bright and beads of sweat peppered his brow. I walked back into the room and went to the woman, who was still in the doorway watching her son. Her face was half buried in her hands as I approached. "My colleague here is going to check your son's pulse and temperature," I said, gesturing towards Jacob. "I'm going to step outside for a moment to grab some more equipment from the ambulance. Is that all right?" "Okay," she nodded in that sheepish way of hers and turned to address Jacob, "but don't get too close to him. He's been lashing out more recently. I tried to feed him earlier and he knocked the bowl right out of my hands." Before leaving the room, I took another look at the boy. His watery eyes were fixed on mine and the sight of them made my stomach wrench. On my way out, I pushed my hand into my trouser pocket and clasped my phone. I would make the call as soon as I got outside of the house. I reached the front door and was struck by the brightness of the sunlight. Peering out of the doorway, I checked up and down the road, but there was no one in sight. I dialed and pressed the phone to my ear. After explaining what I had seen to the operator, she told me that they would send a patrol car out as soon as they could, but they were receiving a high volume of calls that day, so it might be a while. I sighed, hung up the phone, and made my way back into that dismal house. I made it about halfway back up the stairs when I hear Jacob calling out my name. "You need to come up here quick." There was a sense of urgency in his voice. "This kid's got a serious fever." I heard the pounding of my weight on the wooden stairs as I rushed back up to the bedroom. Jacob was crouched by the side of the boy. Serene as ever, the boy's sad eyes moved from Jacob to myself and back. I could hear a tinkling of glass and metal as Jacob rifled through his bag. "He's got a temperature of 46 degrees Celsius, Jacob said, holding up the thermometer with a kind of startled reverence. In disbelief, I strode forward and snatched it out of his hands. "That can't be right," I said, scrutinizing the reading. "The thermometer must be broken." "Feel his forehead." I handed the thermometer back to Jacob, checked that my gloves were secure, and rested my palm on the boy's forehead. The heat was so intense it was as though I had plunged my hand into boiling water. I flinched and drew my hand back. "We need to get him to the hospital immediately." I swiveled around and stared straight at his mother. "You need to get these chains off him right now. He needs urgent medical attention." The woman stammered and shook her head, her eyes wild with fear. "I can't," she said. "There's no way we can get him into the ambulance when he's chained up like this," I said, an edge to my voice that I had to stifle. "We want to do what's best for your son. Please unlock the restraints so we can safely move him into the ambulance." "Okay." The woman plunged her hands into the pockets of her knitted fleece and produced a set of keys. She walked towards Jacob, wavering with every step, and handed him the keys. "You're not going to do it?" I asked, trying to purge the irritation from my voice. "I can't." She backed away from the bed and took up her position in the corner of the room. "I'm sorry." Jacob bent over the boy and fumbled with the keys until he found the right one. There was a satisfying click of the lock and a rumbling sound as the chains fell away. First the legs, then the arms. The boy sat up and rubbed the marks on his wrist. The shadow of a smile danced across his face. I let out a sigh and my muscles relaxed. I could tell Jacob felt the same sense of relief as he looked at me with that toothy grin. Then I heard a sharp sucking sound as the boy buried his fist wrist deep into Jacob's chest. All the while, Jacob was still staring at me with that smile plastered across his face. His body shook in fits and starts as the boy began tearing chunks out his flesh. The woman had started screaming, but in that haze of fear it was as though the noise was muffled. With a frenzied glee, the boy stuffed heaping handfuls of wet meat into his open mouth. Holding the corpse in his claw-like hands, he looked up at me with a face smeared in blood and pulp. There was something wrong with his eyes. Those doe-like eyes had been replaced by oval pupils, cold and reptilian. He dropped the body, which landed with a wet thud. Red flower-like patterns bloomed and seeped into the beige carpet around my colleague. Around Jacob. The boy rose up on the bed, his slender limbs hanging by his sides. He made a series of clicking noises in my direction. With each click, his body twitched and spasmed. He spread his arms out and bent at the knees. His gaze was fixed in preparation to pounce. In one fluid motion, I backed out of the room and slammed the door shut. He ate it with such force that it dislodged the hinges. The sound of him scratching at the wood followed me as I ran down the stairs. I made it to the ambulance and tore open the door to the driver's seat. I patted my trouser pockets. Jacob had the keys. Jacob had the keys and now he's dead, and his body is lying in a bedroom with Lord knows what. There was a crashing sound. I looked up and saw a flash of pale limbs coming down the stairs. The boy was in the doorway. Without thinking, I hurled myself into the back of the ambulance and pressed my body against the cool steel of the side panel. My breathing was heavy and jagged. I covered my mouth with the palm of my hand to stifle the sound. Hot tears stung my cheeks. Curving my body, I strained to hear what was happening outside. There was a faint pattering sound that circled from my right around to my left. The boy was pacing around the ambulance. Click. 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 As he moved, the noise became more frantic. Click. 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 Soon, it was behind me, so close that it felt as though he was breathing down my neck. I shifted my weight just in time. A dent formed in the panel that I had been leaning up against. There was a metallic shearing as his fingers pierced through. Each one was like a tapeworm, wriggling and twitching in an attempt to reach me. Withdrawing his fingers, he let out a sharp cry. Blood trickled down the openings in the metal, as if the side of the ambulance itself were bleeding. It took all of my strength to stifle a scream. I concentrated my attention on the floor, where a speckling of white dots formed as light poured through those holes. Then, it all went quiet. I eased away from the side panel and was about to check the window when 2 footsteps landed heavy on the roof above me. He was on top of the ambulance now. The vehicle pitched and creaked under his weight. Click. 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 I looked up at the moment when the roof caved in. There was no holding it anymore. I screamed until my voice tore out of my throat and my lungs were ragged. The more sound I made, the more frenzied the boy became. Within a matter of minutes, he would be inside. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the flash of blue lights and the familiar whirring of a siren. The pounding on the roof ceased, and was replaced by a shrill noise that cut through me. It was a kind of high-pitched whine like the screech of a microphone. He scrambled above me before I heard a whipping sound as he slipped and tumbled down the front of the ambulance. The windscreen cracked under the force of his weight. He rose to his feet, but his eyes were scrunched shut and his hands were pressed to his ears. Lowering himself back to the ground, he slunk out of sight and I heard a scrabbling sound below me as he scurried away. My heartbeat was still thundering in my chest when the police officer arrived. She wrenched the back door of the ambulance open and found me inside, cowering in the corner. The door to the house was wide open and Jacob was still lying on the floor of the bedroom where I had left him. The woman was alive, but the boy was long gone. The rest of that evening was a blur. I went from police interview to police interview, where I was plied with cups of coffee and asked the same sequence of questions. Night had fallen before someone offered to drive me back to my house. I haven't slept in days. My life has become a waking nightmare, plagued by images of what happened in that house. Every day, I see Jacob's smiling face hovering ahead of me. Every day, I think about how I could have saved him. Jacob is gone, and that boy is still out there. As I stood on my porch staring at the slimy object pinched between my fingers, I couldn't help but think back to that day. I thought about that boy and his reptilian features. When I held it up to the sunlight and saw that pinkish glow at its center, I could no longer ignore the truth. It was skin.